This is a presentation on developing the budget for the grant proposal. I'm Reggie York, University of North Carolina at Wilmington. At the completion of this presentation, you will be able to define critical concepts in budgeting, describe what a budget looks like, define the purpose of the budget for the grant proposal, identify some tips for the preparation of a budget for a grant proposal, prepare a simple budget for a grant proposal in the proper line item format. So basically, you will understand budgeting better. You will have some beginning understanding of how to actually create a budget. You'll need some additional instruction to get yourself prepared to actually prepare a normal budget in its completion. But this will give you a first step, a major first step in regard to being in that kind of position. So what is a budget? A budget is a listing of specific items of expenditure for the program and a listing of the revenue to be used to cover these expenditures, with the source of funds identified in regard to the revenue, such as grant funds, fees from clients, and so forth. So the budget will include all of the things you plan to spend, but also all the sources of revenue you will have to cover those expenditures. So when the bottom line is drawn for your budget, the amount of your expenditures and the amount of your revenues should be equal. You may have a form that lists the costs of personnel, supplies, and so forth in one place, and the revenue to be enumerated in another place. You should use the form that the funding source provides for you to complete your budget. What funding sources expect normally? They expect that you will break down the total amount of money you are requesting into a budget that portrays expenditures by categories, such as equipment, personnel, rent, financial assistance to clients, and so forth. So each item of expenditure will be enumerated on a table, so to speak, with the amount of money to be allocated to each of those items of expenditure. The funding source number will provide a form for you to complete. This is an example of a small portion of the expenditure part of a line item budget. You can see salaries, employee benefits, supplies, and so forth. Often you will have a set of another list of items that'll break down the salaries in another place, one position by another. The general purpose of budgeting is to inform the funding source of how you intend to spend the money that you request, so that they can determine, first of all, if your intended expenditures are consistent with the purpose of your program, if your intended expenditures represent efficient ways to spend the money, and if your intended expenditures are consistent with the rules of the funding source. So the funding agency will be looking at these kinds of things when they look at your budget. I mean, or if you have a particular item in your list for, say, financial assistance to clients, and there's nothing in your proposal that suggests you're going to be giving money to clients, then this would not make sense to the funding source. Efficiency is something funding sources will be looking at, but looking at it usually in a very broad way. Just one thing that just comes to my mind is if you have a big amount of money budgeted for staff members to go to professional conferences in Hawaii or whatever, that's not going to look good. That's going to look like you're not very efficient in the way you're intending to use money. The funding source may have certain rules about that. As a matter of fact, they may have a rule that says you cannot use our funds for conference travel for your staff. That's just one of those things they might say you can't do in a budget for our funding source. What a budget does, let's look at a couple of things. Clearly delineates your plan for spending, illustrates all sources of financial support, indicates that you have thoroughly planned your necessary expenditures. If it's a relatively well done, developed, clear, and so forth, you demonstrate a certain amount of expertise to the funding source in budgeting, and of course that will be impressive. It also informs them, or the funding source, of whether you plan to spend their money on allowable expenditures. Personnel costs often constitute the majority of the funds needed for a human services kind of grant. You identify how many staff are needed and salary of each position. You also identify the amount of money to budget for fringe benefits, such as, for example, health insurance. Often this is a basic percent of each salary amount. You might add 15% to each salary figure to represent the indirect or the fringe benefits for that for each particular position. In-kind expenditures is a concept you may not be familiar with. These are costs associated with the provision of the proposed program that are contributed by current staff of the agency but are not supported by the grant. For example, you may assert that 10% of the agency executive's time will be devoted to this program, but his or her salary is not included in the budget for the grant. So 10% of the salary and the fringe associated with that will be included as part of the in-kind expenditures of the program. So you will show direct expenditures, which are where the funding source is going to be giving you the money for. But you'll also note that there's some in-kind expenditures which the agency is covering. For example, it's in this particular hypothetical case, 10% of the executive's salary is going to be devoted to this particular grant proposal, but the grant funding source is not actually called upon to provide those expenditures. So the more you can put in-kind expenditures and other sources of funds, the better off you typically are in convincing the funding source that you are using money wisely. Here are some steps in the budgeting process. Determine the staff positions needed and the salary for each position. Determine the fringe benefit amount to be added for each salary. Determine the cost of other items like housing, supplies, financial assistance to clients, etc. And that'll vary, of course, with the kind of program that you are proposing. Put all figures in the budget form supplied by the funding source. There are some non-grant expenditures. In some situations, the funding source will also expect you to insert costs of your proposed program that are not to be in the funds you are requesting. Examples, you may be collecting fees from clients. It may be part of the total budget for the program, but it's not a part of what you're asking the funding source to give you. You might have grant funds from other sources. And of course, you may have in-kind expenditures. So these are some of the examples of non-grant expenditures that support the program. They contribute to the program, that make the program possible, even though they are not themselves funded by the actual grant. Here are a few tips. Make the budget realistic, but don't be too shy in asking for funds. Ask for what you will need, but not more. I have heard grant writers talk about asking for a lot more than you need. I don't think that's wise. I believe if the funding source suspects that that's what you're doing, they're not going to be very impressed with your ability to allocate and expend funds efficiently. Make sure the figures on the budget form are correct. It's very easy to make a mistake there, so get people to check it out who are good at doing this kind of thing. Don't make a big mistake on your budget form. Make sure the totals for expenditures and revenue are equal. You might have, just make sure they're equal. This is the end of the presentation.